Assalamu alaikum class. Today we are going to study about epidemiology. By the end of this lecture, you will be able to achieve the following objectives. First, you will be able to define epidemiology and its application. You will know what morbidity is, mortality is, incidence and prevalence. What are the three basic types of epidemiological investigation? How we can classify a disease on the basis of frequency of occurrence, and what's the role of a reservoir, whether living or non-living, in disease spread and different modes of disease transmission. At the end, we will discuss some nosocomial infection and explain the importance and prevention, and make a list of few emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases, and what are the agencies which actually monitor these epidemiological advances. Today's crowded, overpopulated world, in which frequent travel in the mass production and distribution of food and other goods are a way of life, disease can spread very easily and rapidly. A contaminated food or water supply, for example, can affect many thousands of people very quickly. Identifying the causative agent of the disease is desirable, so it can be effectively controlled and treated. It is also required to find out the mode of transmission and geographical distribution of disease. Therefore, the science of knowing the transmission and occurrence of a disease is very important. This study is called epidemiology. Epidemiology deals with when and where a disease occurs and how they are transmitted in a population, as well as prevention and control. So it's basically a branch of public health science. So there are five W's in epidemiology. The first one is what? Like, what is the health event or disease? That's diagnosis. Second, who? The person who is infected, where it took place, when it took place, and what are the causes and risk factors, and how it's transmitted. So it's a combination of five W's which have an answer result in the study of epidemiology. So the results of this study can be used to propose appropriate, practical and acceptable public health interventions or controls to prevent diseases in a community. John Snow is considered as the father of field of epidemiology because of his famous studies in 1854 when an epidemic of cholera erupted in Golden Square of London. He began his investigation by mapping the area in which the infected people lived and worked. He marked each resident on the map. Because Snow believed that the water was the source of infection of cholera, he marked the location of water pumps in each map, then looked for a relationship between the distribution of household with the cases of cholera and the location of map pumps. He noticed that most of the case household clustered around pump A, and the pump B and pump C surroundings were free of any infected person. When he questioned the resident who lived in this Golden Square area, he was told that they avoided pump B because it was grossly contaminated and pump C was too far away. From this information, Snow concluded that the Broad Street pump A was the primary source of water and the most likely source of infection of most of the people living in this Golden Square area. After Snow presented his finding to the municipal committee, the hand pump handle was removed and the epidemic was stopped. Now let's look at the basic terms used in epidemiology. Morbidity is the incidence of a specific notifiable disease, and mortality is the death from a notifiable disease. So generally we use two terms to represent the ratio of morbidity and mortality of a disease. So morbidity rate is the number of people affected in a population in relation to total population at a specific period of time. However, mortality is the number of deaths caused by a disease in relation to the total population, again at a very specific point. Just remember, morbidity is the person affected by a disease and mortality is the number of deaths from a disease. Occurrence of a disease in a population can be determined by either by incidence or prevalence. Incidence is the number of new cases over a particular period of time. That means it represents the spread of a disease. So incidence can be calculated by calculating the number of new cases over a particular period of time divided by the number of or size of the population at risk multiplied by 100. This is incidence rate. So these are only considered only the new cases of a disease at a specific time. For example, we say that 10 new people are infected by COVID-19 in April 2020. That would be an incidence of a disease. In contrast, prevalence is the fraction of a population having a specific disease at a given time, regardless of when it was first appeared. So it considers both the old cases and the new cases in a population. And it is an indicator how serious a disease is and what's the length of disease and how it's affecting a population. So we can also calculate the prevalence rate in a population by using the formula, like we can divide the total number of cases at a particular time and divide it by the size of the population at risk into 100. So for example, we can say there were total 200 people infected with COVID-19 in April 2020. So in prevalence, we consider all the cases which are still active in that time period. They may be both old and new. So in prevalence rate, we only exclude those people who either have died or have recovered from a disease. Now let's see how we can calculate the incidence and prevalence. Suppose this is the data of a certain town in Pakistan. The first point shows us the total number of preschool children, that is below the age of 5 from 0 to 5 years in 2010. That's equal to 6,000. So this is the population at risk. We do not consider children which are above the age of 5 or adults because they won't be affected with polio. The second thing is we can see here that the total number of new cases in year 2010, that's 15, and third data is about the total number of children below the age of 5 which were diagnosed with polio at a specific date. They are equal to 130 in 2010. So incidence rate is like the new cases divided by the population at risk, that is by 6,000 into 100. So incidence rate is 0.25% for this specific town at a specific time, that is in 2010. So prevalence rate is like the total number of cases which we have in point number 3, 130 divided by total which are 6,000 into 100. So prevalence rate is 2.1%. Let's look at the difference between incidence and prevalence with the help of this video.
And what's the difference between incidence and prevalence? Let's take a group of 5 people who develop tuberculosis over a period of 6 months. One develops the disease in January, 2 in February, 1 in April, and 1 in May. So ignoring the denominator for now, the incident cases in February, for example, would be 2. Or in other words, 2 would be the numerator of the incidence rate for that month. And it would be 1 for the months of January, April, and May. Now, prevalence also takes into account the duration of the disease. Let's say case number 1 is cured in May, case number 2 is cured in April, case number 3 in March, case 4 and 5 during the second half of the year. Now let's look at the prevalence of tuberculosis in these months. Let's also just focus on the numerator, or the prevalent cases during each month. We have 1 case in January, 3 cases in February, 3 in March, 3 in April, 3 in May, and 2 in June. So prevalence is determined by how many people join the prevalence pool, or the incidence, and how many leave the prevalence pool through death or cure. Let us depict that with a vessel full of pebbles. The vessel is filled with pebbles, or new cases, by the incidence rate, and it's emptied by death or cure. This means that if death goes up, then more people will leave the vessel, and if death goes down, then more people will stay in the vessel. And the same thing applies for cure. If more people are cured, more pebbles or people will leave the vessel, and if cure rate goes down, then more pebbles or people will stay in the vessel. Let's have a closer look. Let's say this is our baseline prevalence. Now, what happens to prevalence if incidence goes up? While death and cure stay the same? It has to go up, right? What happens if incidence stays the same, but death goes down, while cure rate stays the same? It will go up, since fewer pebbles will leave the vessel. What if death goes down and cure rate goes up? Well, as you probably guessed correctly, prevalence will decrease since more pebbles will leave the vessel.
So students, it's time for our first concept checkpoint. The first question, you have to calculate the annual incidence rate of lung cancer in 2004 USA and the mortality rate in the same year. In the second question, using this diagram, you have to calculate the prevalence of disease during July and similarly the incidence of that disease in July. We will discuss the answers in our interactive section.